The first thing she noticed was the silence. It was not the peaceful quiet of the countryside, but a dense, waiting stillness that seemed to press in from the stone walls of Dunmore Hall. Her carriage, the crest of her fiancé, her former fiancé, still emblazoned on the door, crunched to a halt on the gravel drive. The sound was immediately swallowed by the oppressive quiet. A footman opened the door without a word, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. Eleanor Shaw stepped out, her plain gray traveling dress feeling flimsy against the cold, damp air that clung to the ancient stones of the Duke's fortress. She was a parcel, delivered and signed for. The great oak doors swung inward, revealing a hall that was more mausoleum than entrance. Dark wood paneling soared into shadow, and a chandelier, unlit, hung like a skeletal spider from the coffered ceiling. And there he was, the Duke of Dunmore. He stood at the base of a sweeping stone staircase, a figure of stark, severe lines in a world of gloom. He was taller than she had expected, dressed in a black coat that seemed to absorb what little light dared to enter the hall. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, his dark hair unadorned, and a thin white scar cut a path from his temple to the sharp line of his jaw. He did not move, simply watched her approach, his eyes a shade of gray that matched the stormy sky outside. He was not the monster of rumor, the ghoulish figure whispered about in London drawing rooms. He was something far more unnerving, a man entirely empty of expression. "Miss Shaw," he said. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of warmth or welcome. It was the sound of stone grinding on stone. "You are the settlement of Lord Finch's debt." He spoke the words as if discussing the price of corn. There was no apology, no pity, only a flat statement of fact. Eleanor inclined her head, her spine straight. She had cried all her tears in the 2 days since Julian had told her. There were none left. "I am, Your Grace." He gave a curt nod, a minimalist gesture that seemed to take great effort. The matter was concluded for the sum of £20,000, a significant overvaluation in my opinion. But Lord Finch was insistent. He did not say it cruelly, but the words landed like small, sharp stones, reminding her that she was not a bride, but a balance sheet entry. She was chattel, traded to a man whose 3 previous wives were dead. The county called it a curse. Eleanor, who had managed Julian's failing estate for 2 years, knew that curses were often just convenient names for human failings. She met his gaze directly, refusing to be cowed. "The value of an asset is determined by the desperation of the buyer, Your Grace, or perhaps the seller." A flicker of something, surprise, interest, crossed his face before it was extinguished. For a moment, the silence stretched, a taut wire between them. Then he turned. "Come. There are terms to discuss." He led her not toward the grand reception rooms, but to a narrow, unassuming door tucked beneath the staircase. He opened it and gestured her inside, into a study that smelled of old leather, beeswax, and cold ashes. The door clicked shut behind her, a sound of absolute finality, sealing her inside the fortress with its master and his ghosts. Thank you for joining us. Subscribe for more stories of contracts that become confessions, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The story of what happened within those walls is only just beginning. Just 3 days before, Eleanor had been seated in that very same study at Finch Manor, though it was a room of gilded clutter and feigned prosperity. She had spent the morning reviewing the estate ledgers, the neat columns of her own handwriting a stark contrast to the chaotic reality they represented. She found the latest discrepancy, a withdrawal of 500 sovereigns from the tenant accounts, and her stomach tightened. She knew where it had gone, to the gaming hells that were consuming Julian piece by piece. When she presented the ledger to him, he had smiled, his charming, feckless smile that had once convinced her he was a man of substance. "My dear Eleanor, you mustn't trouble your pretty head with these matters. It is merely an investment in ruin." Her stepmother, Lady Finch, had entered then, patting Julian's arm. "Eleanor, darling, a lady's mind is for poetry and watercolors, not for vulgar sums. Leave the business of the world to men." Eleanor had looked at the woman who had made her life a misery since her father's death, and at the man who was squandering her future, and saw them for the hollow conspirators they were. Her competence was not a virtue to them, it was a resource to be drained. The confession came that night, that Julian found her in the library, his face pale, the scent of brandy heavy on his breath. There was no more charm, only the raw, ugly panic of a cornered animal. "I am ruined, Eleanor," he whispered, slumping into a chair. "Utterly." He explained it all, the cards, the horses, the debts mounting until they were a tidal wave. And then he told her of his solution. He had made a wager with the one man in England who was feared more than any creditor, the Duke of Dunmore. A man so desperate to quiet the rumors of his curse, so in need of a fourth wife to prove his house was not a tomb, that he was willing to forgive an astronomical debt in exchange for a bride. "He will take you, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old confidence, as if he were presenting her with a gift. "His debt is forgiven. Our family name is saved. You will be a duchess." He did not see the horror in her eyes. He saw only his own salvation. "He is a recluse," Julian added, a dismissive wave of his hand. "He will likely leave you to your own devices. Think of it, a grand title and a vast estate to manage. It's what you're good at, after all." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was not just selling her. He was framing the transaction as a promotion, a role for which her own exploited skills had perfectly prepared her. She was not a person to him. She was the final, most valuable asset to be liquidated. The Duke's study was the antithesis of Finch Manor. There were no gilded frames, no plush velvets, no porcelain figures. The room was a testament to function. Walls of dark, unadorned bookshelves rose to the ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes organized with geometric precision. A single large desk of dark oak stood in the center, its surface clear save for an inkwell, a blotter, and a neat stack of papers. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, the only source of warmth in the austere space. Alistair, the Duke, gestured to the straight-backed chair opposite his own. He did not sit until she did. He moved with a contained economy, no wasted motion, as if he were conserving energy for a battle that never ended. Once seated, he folded his hands on the desk and looked at her, his gray eyes analytical. "The arrangement is as follows," he began, his voice as flat and hard as the polished surface of the desk. "You will be the Duchess of Dunmore. This title will afford you certain protections and a status in society, should you ever choose to engage with it. You will be the mistress of this household. Its management, its staff, its accounts are your domain. I expect them to be run with efficiency." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the quiet room. "In return, you will have my name and the security of this house. You will want for nothing material. Food, clothing, any reasonable expense will be provided. What I will not provide," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "is companionship. I will not provide affection. My evenings are my own. You will not ask about my past, nor will you inquire about the women who held your title before you. Their history is not your concern. We will take our meals separately, unless an occasion demands otherwise. Your wing of the house will be your own. Mine is not to be entered. Our marriage will be in name, and in name only. He stated the terms with the dispassionate clarity of a solicitor reading a will. It was a contract for cohabitation, a business proposal. There was no pretense, no false comfort. Eleanor listened, her hands clasped in her lap. After the suffocating hypocrisy of Julian's world, this cold, brutal honesty was like a draught of clean, sharp air. Here, she knew the rules. Here, the indifference was overt, not hidden behind saccharine words of affection. Cold was survivable. Active cruelty, dressed as love, was a poison that rotted from the inside out. "And my duties?" she asked, her voice steady. "You require an heir?" A muscle in his scarred cheek tightened. "No. The Dunmore line has caused enough grief. I require a duchess to manage my home and put an end to the speculation that surrounds it. That is all." Eleanor met his gaze. "The terms are acceptable, Your Grace." He nodded once, the transaction complete. He pushed a piece of paper across the desk. It was a marriage license, already signed by him. All it needed was her name. As she took the pen, a severe, gray-haired woman entered without knocking. Her face was a road map of disapproval. "Mrs. Gable," the Duke said, "this is the new Duchess. See to her rooms." The housekeeper's eyes swept over Eleanor, a quick, dismissive appraisal that took in her plain dress and her lack of luggage. The look was a mixture of pity and contempt. It was the look one gave to a lamb being led to slaughter. In the days that followed, Eleanor learned the rhythms of Dunmore Hall. It was a house holding its breath. The staff, a skeleton crew of aging servants, moved like ghosts through the cavernous corridors, their footfalls silenced by dust-thick runners. They spoke in whispers, their eyes perpetually downcast. Mrs. Gable ran the household with rigid, joyless efficiency, her presence a constant, silent judgment. The steward, a man named Thorne with a perpetually sour expression and shifty eyes, seemed to resent Eleanor's very existence. Only Agnes, the young maid assigned to her, showed any flicker of warmth. She was a quiet girl with wide, watchful eyes, who left hot tea by Eleanor's bedside without being asked, and knew how to be present without speaking. Eleanor did not wait for an invitation to begin her work. She requested the household ledgers, and after a brief, tense standoff with Mr. Thorne, who claimed they were not her concern, a single, sharp word from the Duke had them delivered to her private sitting room. They were a disaster. The pages were a mess of sloppy entries, inconsistent figures, and blatant overcharges from local suppliers. For 2 years, she had untangled Julian's deliberate deceptions. This was mere neglect, a rot that had set in from simple inattention. She started there, with ink and paper, creating order from chaos. She spent her days in the estate office, a cold, damp room that smelled of mildew. She wrote letters to suppliers, her penmanship clear and firm, renegotiating contracts, questioning invoices. Mr. Thorne watched her, his arms crossed, a sneer barely concealed on his thin lips. He made it clear he considered her an interloper, a temporary inconvenience. When not at her desk, Eleanor explored. The west wing of the house was shuttered, its furniture draped in white cloths like rows of shrouded corpses. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. But it was the gardens that drew her most. They had once been magnificent. She could see the bones of it in the sprawling, overgrown rose arches and the choked, weed-filled parterres. Now they were a wilderness of neglect. Thorns choked the life from climbing roses, and the paths were obscured by encroaching brambles. She found an old groundskeeper, a man named Hemlock with hands as gnarled as ancient roots, sitting on a stone bench, staring at the decay. He was the only person who seemed to mourn it. One afternoon, she picked up a pair of discarded shears and began methodically to cut back the dead wood from a single, resilient rosebush. Hemlock watched her for a long time before he spoke. "That one's a maiden's blush," he rasped. "Ain't bloomed in 5 years." Eleanor did not reply, but she returned the next day and the next. She rarely saw the Duke, but she felt his presence. He was an observer, sometimes, looking up from her ledgers in the library late at night. She would see his shadow disappear from the doorway. Once, as she was directing 2 footmen in the proper way to polish the grand staircase's balustrade, a task they had apparently forgotten, she caught a glimpse of him at the top of the stairs, watching her, his face unreadable in the gloom. They ate in silence, as stipulated, at opposite ends of a dining table that could have seated 30. The clink of cutlery was the only conversation. But one evening, as she rose to leave, he spoke. "The steward reports you have reduced the butcher's bill by 20%. It was a statement, not a question. "The butcher was charging us for prime cuts and delivering offal, Your Grace," she replied simply. "I have corrected his error." He just nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual before he returned to his wine. It was not praise, but it was an acknowledgement. In the silent, cold world of Dunmore Hall, it felt like a seismic shift. Eleanor's quest for order led her inevitably to the estate archives, a labyrinth of rooms in the hall's oldest section. Here, the history of Dunmore was stored in towering stacks of document boxes and leather-bound ledgers. It was a place of dust and memory, largely abandoned. While trying to locate the original deeds for the tenant farms, she discovered a small, locked mahogany cabinet tucked away in an alcove. It was unmarked, unlike the other archives. When she asked Mrs. Gable about it, the housekeeper's face tightened. "That holds the personal effects of the late duchesses," she said, her voice clipped. "His Grace ordered it sealed." The key, she learned, was kept on the large iron ring that Mr. Thorne, the steward, wore at his belt at all times. Her interest was piqued, but it was a quiet observation from Agnes that gave her the means to act. "Mr. Thorne takes a nap in his office every day after his lunch, Your Grace," the maid whispered one afternoon while brushing Eleanor's hair. "Always hangs his keys on the hook by the door." The next day, Eleanor waited. With her heart pounding a quiet rhythm against her ribs, she slipped into the steward's empty office, lifted the heavy ring from its hook, and made her way to the archives. The key turned with a stiff, protesting groan. The cabinet held 3 velvet-lined boxes. The first 2, belonging to the first and second wives, contained little more than dried flowers, a few letters, and household receipts. It was the third box, labeled Isabel, that held the truth. Inside, beneath a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, was a small leather-bound journal. Eleanor took it back to her room and began to read. Lady Isabel's handwriting, at first elegant and flowing, grew increasingly spidery and erratic as the pages turned. She wrote of a profound and creeping malaise, a weariness that settled deep in her bones. "Another day of fog in my head," one entry read. "Dr. Ansell says it is merely feminine nerves, a consequence of the country air. He prescribed rest." A few weeks later, "The weakness is worse. My hands tremble so I can barely hold a pen. Alistair looks at me with such pity. I see the fear in his eyes, the fear that he is the cause of this, that the house itself is poison to his wives. I try to be strong for him, but it is a monumental effort. Then came the crucial entry. Mr. Thorne is most solicitous. He brings me a special herbal tonic each evening for my nerves, an old family recipe, he says. The doctor approves, but after I drink it, the fog in my mind thickens, and my limbs feel like lead. I told Alistair, but he trusts Thorne implicitly, says the man's family has served Dunmore for a century. Eleanor's blood ran cold. It wasn't a curse. It was poison. Tucked into the back of the journal was a sheaf of correspondence. They were letters from Thorne to a creditor, promising imminent payment on a substantial gambling debt. The creditor was a name Eleanor knew all too well, Lord Finch. Not Julian, but his father. The scheme was older and deeper than she could have imagined. A crisis of trust bloomed in her chest. Did Alistair know? Was his coldness a performance, his grief a lie? Was he a partner in this slow, methodical murder? She closed the journal, the silence of the house suddenly feeling malevolent, and knew she had to confront him. That night, the library was their battleground. Eleanor waited for him, the journal and the damning letters laid out on the low table before the hearth. When Alistair entered, he stopped short upon seeing her. He rarely found her in this room so late, and her posture, ramrod straight in the armchair, her face pale in the firelight, alerted him that this was no chance encounter. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low but clear. "We need to speak." He approached slowly, his gaze falling to the items on the table. He recognized Isabel's journal instantly. His face, usually a mask of control, tightened. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "That is not the question you should be asking," Eleanor replied, meeting his stormy gaze. She tapped the journal. "Did you know? Did you know she was being poisoned in your own house?" The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and glittering as a shard of glass. She watched him, ready for denial, for rage, for the cold dismissal she had come to expect. Instead, she saw something shatter in his eyes. The control, the carefully constructed emptiness, cracked like a fault line in stone. He sank into the opposite chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. His face ashen. He stared at the journal, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. "Poisoned?" he whispered, the word sounding alien on his tongue. He shook his head, a gesture of profound, bewildered denial. "No. The doctor said it was her nerves, a wasting sickness of the spirit. He said this place, that I was the cause." The confession came out of him in a raw, broken torrent. He told her everything. His first wife, Clara, had died in childbirth, taking their infant son with her. His second, Anne, was taken by a sudden, violent fever that swept through the county. With Isabel, it was different. It was slow, insidious. He had watched her fade day by day and had blamed himself. He believed the whispers. He believed he was cursed, a man whose love, or lack of it, was lethal. He retreated into his grief, into the cold, silent shell she had first met, trusting his household to others, trusting Thorne to manage everything while he drowned in guilt. As he spoke, Eleanor's suspicion dissolved, replaced by a wave of something akin to compassion. This was not a monster. This was a man hollowed out by grief and shame. His coldness wasn't cruelty. It was a shield, a self-imposed quarantine. They were not adversaries. They were two people trapped in the same web of deceit, spun years ago by men like her fiancé and his father. Thorne was in debt to the old Lord Finch, she said softly, pushing the letters toward him. It seems the Finches have long seen the women of this house as a means to an end. He looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a storm of fury and a dawning, terrible understanding. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was filled with a new, shared purpose. They were allies, and at that exact moment, as if summoned by the devil himself, the sound of a carriage arriving on the gravel drive echoed through the quiet house. A footman appeared at the library door, his face pale. "Your Grace," he stammered. "Lord Julian Finch is here. He says he has come to see the Duchess." Julian Finch swept into the grand hall of Dunmore as if he were its master. He was dressed in the height of London fashion, his waistcoat a gaudy splash of color in the hall's oppressive gloom. He smiled his brilliant, predatory smile, though it faltered slightly as he took in the severe, clean lines of the hall. Eleanor had already put the staff to work removing years of dust and decay. He saw her standing at the base of the stairs, and his smile widened. "Eleanor, my dear," he said, his voice oozing a proprietary concern that made her skin crawl. "I had to come. I have been so worried. In this dreadful place, with its history." He advanced on her, his intention clear, to take her arm, to re-establish his claim in front of the servants who watched from the shadows. Before he could reach her, a figure emerged from the library. Alistair. He moved without a sound, positioning himself between Eleanor and Julian. He was a wall of black wool and silent fury. He did not speak, simply stood there, an immovable object of pure menace. The two men were a study in contrasts. Julian, all polished surface and glittering falsehood. Alistair, a man of stark, unadorned, and terrifying substance. Julian's smile tightened. "Dunmore," he said, with forced joviality. "Just came to see to Eleanor's welfare. As her former fiancé, I still feel a certain responsibility." It was then that Eleanor found her voice, a voice she hadn't realized she'd lost. It was not loud, but it cut through the tense silence of the hall with the clarity of a bell. "My welfare is no longer your concern, Lord Finch," she said, stepping to the side of Alistair, not behind him. They stood as equals. "You forfeited any claim to responsibility when you sold me to settle your gambling debts." A gasp rippled through the watching staff. Julian's face paled, then flushed with anger. "Eleanor, you are overwrought. This place is clearly affecting you." He turned to Alistair, appealing to him as one man of sense to another. "You must forgive her. She is a delicate creature prone to hysterics." Eleanor lifted her chin. "I have never been hysterical in my life. I am, however, the Duchess of Dunmore, and you will address me as Your Grace." The sheer audacity of her command stunned Julian into silence. He stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time, not as a pretty, useful accessory, but as a queen in her own domain. Alistair remained silent, letting her hold the floor, his stillness a powerful endorsement of her authority. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute power in this house. "You heard the Duchess," he said to Julian. "Leave." Julian sputtered, his mask of charm finally crumbling to reveal the snarling ambition beneath. But one look at the Duke's face, a face that promised violence with a chilling lack of passion, and he knew he was defeated. He gave a stiff, jerky bow. "Your Grace!" he spat, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He turned and stormed out, the great oak doors closing behind him with a boom that echoed the finality of his expulsion. In the ringing silence, Eleanor looked at Alistair. He had not rescued her. He had stood with her while she rescued herself. A new foundation was settling between them, solid and sure as the ancient stones of the hall. A few nights later, the library had become a different kind of space. It was no longer a place of confrontation or silent coexistence, but a shared sanctuary against the quiet chill of the house. A large fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the bookshelves. Eleanor sat at a small writing desk she had moved near the flames, the Dunmore account books open before her. With Alistair's full authority, she was conducting a thorough audit, tracing the web of Mr. Thorne's deceit. The steward had been dismissed, confined to his rooms under the watch of a loyal groundskeeper until the local magistrate could be summoned. Alistair sat in his usual armchair, a book open in his lap, but he was not reading. He was watching her. He watched the way the firelight caught the warm tones in her brown hair, the intense focus in her eyes as she worked, the decisive flick of her wrist as she made a note in the margin. He had spent years in this house with ghosts, drowning in a silence of his own making. He had believed it was his penance. But in the past weeks, Eleanor had filled the silence not with chatter, but with purpose. The quiet hum of a household being brought back to order, the scent of beeswax and lemon polish replacing the smell of dust and decay, the sound of her pen scratching against paper late into the night. These were the sounds of life returning. He finally broke the comfortable silence. "I never understood what a home was meant to be," he said, his voice low and reflective. "I thought it was merely stone and timber and silence, a place to keep the world out." Eleanor looked up, her pen pausing over the ledger. "You have brought order," he continued, searching for the right word, "and life. The house is breathing again." It was the most vulnerable thing she had ever heard him say. It was not a declaration of love, not a flowery compliment, but something far more profound, a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of her essential impact on his world. It was a truth delivered with the same plainness he used for discussing crop yields or estate boundaries. "I was a commodity," she replied, her own voice soft but clear. "An entry in a ledger, traded to settle a debt. You gave me a place to work. You gave me a purpose beyond being an ornament. That was more than anyone else ever had." He rose from his chair and crossed the small space between them. He stood before her desk, looking down at her, his severe face softened by the firelight. Slowly, as if uncertain of his right to do so, he reached out and laid his hand over hers where it rested on the open ledger. His touch was warm and firm. It was not the touch of a master or a keeper, but of a partner. "You are not a commodity, Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "You are the Duchess. You are essential." For a brief moment, the narrator's view shifted, and we saw her as he did. Not as the woman who had arrived as payment, but as the architect of his world's slow and miraculous restoration. The wall of ice around his heart did not just crack. It melted away in the warmth of the firelit room. The annual Harwick County Assembly Ball was the pinnacle of the social season, a glittering affair that the Duke of Dunmore had not graced with his presence in nearly a decade. This year, the news that he would be attending, with his new Duchess, had sent shockwaves of speculation through the district. When they arrived, a hush fell over the grand ballroom. Alistair, imposing in formal black evening wear, was a familiar, if feared, figure. But it was Eleanor who drew every eye. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, a bolt of fabric she had discovered in a forgotten trunk in the attics. Its design was starkly simple, unadorned with the lace and frills favored by the other women, and it made her stand out like a star in a field of candles. She wore no jewels save for the heavy, antique ring of the Dunmore duchesses. On Alistair's arm, she did not look trapped or cowed. She looked regal. They found Julian Finch holding court near the champagne fountain, Eleanor's stepmother preening at his side. They were whispering, casting venomous glances in their direction, cultivating the narrative of the poor, doomed bride and the monstrous, cursed duke. Julian, seeing them, decided to force a confrontation. He approached, his smile a mask of predatory charm. "Your Grace," he said, raising his glass to Eleanor. "A toast to your health and your longevity. May you have better luck than your predecessors." The insult was public, designed to humiliate her and remind everyone of the rumors. The crowd around them fell silent, waiting for the explosion. Before Alistair could move, Eleanor stepped forward slightly, her expression serene. Her voice, though quiet, carried with perfect clarity in the sudden stillness. "Thank you for your concern, Lord Finch. I find the country air at Dunmore agrees with me, as does the work." She gave him a small, chilling smile. "In fact, while reviewing the Dunmore estate accounts, I uncovered the most fascinating series of payments made by our former steward, a Mr. Thorne. Large sums funneled through a complex series of banks to cover the gambling debts of your late father." Another collective gasp went through the onlookers. Julian's face went white. "These are baseless accusations, a woman's fantasy." At that precise moment, the ballroom doors opened and 2 county constables entered. They moved with quiet purpose through the stunned crowd, not to the Duke, but to a pale, sweating Mr. Thorne, who had been trying to shrink into the shadows near the exit. As they placed him under arrest, the chief constable approached Julian. "Lord Finch," he said, his voice booming in the hall, "you are required for questioning in connection with charges of fraud and conspiracy." The public unmasking was absolute. The whispers turned from gossip about a curse to shock at a crime. As Julian was led away, protesting his innocence to a suddenly deaf audience, Alistair placed a proprietary hand on the small of Eleanor's back. He looked not at the disgraced Finch, but at the assembled gentry, his voice ringing with pride. "My wife," he announced, "is the most capable and intelligent woman in this county. Thanks to her diligence, the House of Dunmore is solvent and secure for the first time in a generation." He did not praise her beauty or her charm. He validated her competence, her mind, her work. It was the highest compliment he could pay. He then leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Shall we go home, Your Grace?" She nodded, and they swept out of the ballroom together, leaving society to its frantic, revised speculations. Months passed. The chill of winter gave way to a gentle, persistent spring. At Dunmore Hall, the transformation was nearly complete. The stones seemed warmer, the hallways brighter, the silence now a comfortable peace instead of a waiting dread. The gardens, under Eleanor's direction, and Mr. Hemlock's gnarled, knowing hands, were undergoing a glorious resurrection. The rose arches, once tangled skeletons, were now covered in the tender green of new leaves. Early daffodils trumpeted yellow along the newly cleared paths. One bright afternoon, Eleanor and Alistair walked these paths together. The air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. He had fallen into the habit of joining her for these afternoon walks, a quiet ritual that had replaced their formal, silent dinners. He stopped beside the maiden's blush rosebush, which was now covered in tight, promising buds. He turned to her, his expression serious. Though the harsh lines of his face had softened over the months, he took both of her hands in his. "The contract is fulfilled, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and steady. "Thorne and Finch have been charged. Your name and mine have been cleared. The household is in order. You have done everything I asked of you, and more." He paused, his thumbs stroking the backs of her hands. "By the terms of our agreement, you are free. If you wish to leave, I will not stop you. I will see you are provided for, of course. A house in town, a generous income, whatever you require." He was offering her an escape, an honorable discharge from the duty she had been sold into. He was giving her back the choice that had been stolen from her. She looked up at him, into his stormy gray eyes, and saw not a duke or a master, but the man who watched her from doorways, who listened to her opinions on crop rotation, who had stood beside her as she faced down her demons. "And where would I go?" she asked softly, a small smile playing on her lips. "Finch Manor is to be sold to pay Julian's debts, and this—" She looked around at the awakening garden, at the proud stone walls of the house behind them. "This is my home. I cleared these paths. I balanced these books. I brought this place back to life. It is as much mine as it is yours." A look of profound relief washed over his face. He took a half-step closer, his gaze intense. He said it then, not with flowery poetry or grand pronouncements, but with the simple, declarative certainty he reserved for absolute truths. "I love you, Eleanor." She did not feign surprise. She had felt it growing between them, a hardy, resilient thing like the roses she had tended. "I know," she replied, her own voice full of a quiet, unshakable confidence. "I love you, Alistair." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple, unadorned gold band. It was worn with age, warm from his pocket. He slid it onto her finger, next to the formal, heavy ducal ring. "It was my mother's," he said. And they stood there for a long time, hands linked, two solitary figures together in the garden they had rebuilt, the curse broken not by magic, but by methodical, steadfast, and unexpected love. Thank you for joining us for this story. Did Eleanor make the right choice to stay? Let us know what you think in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. In the end, it seems the best alliances often begin as the most honest transactions.